July 2, 1943, Castelvetrano Airfield, Sicily. A German Focke-Wulf 190 pilot never saw the P-40 Warhawk dropping out of the sun until bullets shredded his plane, sending it spinning into the Sicilian countryside. At the controls was First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, just 22 years old, from Brazil, Indiana. In that moment, he proved something German commanders thought impossible. A black pilot had just shot down one of their elite fighters. Hall painted a swastika on his P-40L that afternoon, the first of 112 enemy aircraft the Tuskegee Airmen would destroy. The Germans would come to know them as the Schwarze-Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. In Nazi ideology, black people were labeled Untermensch, subhuman. They were seen as incapable of handling complex machines, let alone excelling in combat. The Nuremberg laws had even banned Germans from marrying people of African descent. But high above the Mediterranean, those beliefs were colliding with reality. From Tuskegee, Alabama, 992 trained pilots entered the war. They weren't just skilled. They were some of the best trained, most determined aviators in the U.S. Army Air Forces. They had overcome barriers their white peers never faced, endured tougher training, and carried into battle not only the responsibility of defending their country, but the burden of proving their entire race's worth. As German pilots climbed to meet American bombers in 1943, they had no idea who was waiting for them. What followed would rewrite the math of aerial combat and shatter the myth of racial superiority in the skies over Europe. 5,000 combat sorties, 578 missions, 112 enemy planes shot from the sky, a bomber escort record better than most white fighter groups. Numbers so strong they forced even the most die-hard Nazi racists to face the collapse of their so-called racial theories. But that story didn't begin in combat. It began in the harsh reality of American segregation. Back in 1925, the U.S. Army War College published a report called Employment of Negro Manpower in War. It bluntly declared, compared to the white man, he is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character. According to the military itself, black soldiers weren't smart enough for technical jobs or brave enough for combat leadership, yet reality kept proving them wrong. Eugene Bullard had already flown with the French in World War I because the U.S. wouldn't let him serve as a pilot. In 1921, Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license in France since no flight school in America would take her. By the 1930s, the Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago had trained dozens of black civilian pilots, showing once and for all that flying talent had no color. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the demand for change grew louder. Civil rights leaders pressed harder, and soon, the stage was set for history to be rewritten in the skies. Civil rights leaders like Walter White of the NAACP, labor leader A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hasty pushed tirelessly for black inclusion in military aviation. Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Baltimore Afro-American, pressed the Roosevelt administration with one sharp question. How can America fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? On April 3, 1939, Public Law 18 cracked the door open. Senator Harry H. Schwartz slipped in an amendment requiring at least one flight school under the civilian pilot training program to train black pilots. It was a concession born out of pressure wrapped in segregation, but it was still a beginning. By 1940, Franklin Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented third term, and he knew he needed black votes in key northern cities. On January 16, 1941, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson made the announcement that changed history, the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. That was the headline. But the announcement came with a catch. The military called it an experiment. Test to see if black men could even be trained as combat. Pilots. Captain Benjamin O. Davis. Jr. knew exactly what that meant when he led 26 pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron to North Africa in April. 43. The son of America's first black general, Davis had already endured 4 years of cold silence at West Point, where white cadets refused to speak to him except on official duty. Now he carried more than command. He carried the hopes of 13 million black Americans on his shoulders. The 99th touched down at Farjuna, Tunisia, assigned to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Momier, a man who didn't bother hiding his doubts about black pilots. He gave them safe, low-risk patrols over the Mediterranean, keeping them far from the real fight. Colonel Maumier wanted them to fail. And when the 99th didn't immediately shine, he thought he had his excuse. On the morning of June 2nd, 1943, the squadron flew its first combat mission, an attack on the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. As their worn P-40 Warhawks climbed toward target, German fighters suddenly appeared. The Tuskegee pilots held their formation, guarding the bombers. No planes were lost on either side, but the message was clear. These men wouldn't crack under pressure. Then came July 2nd, 1943, the day that changed everything. Charles Hall was flying his 8th mission, escorting B-25 Mitchell bombers toward Castelvetrono airfield in Sicily. Suddenly, 2 Focke-Wulf 190s closed in on the bomber formation. Hall later recalled, I saw 2 Focke-Wulfs tailing the bombers just after they dropped their loads. I cut in between the fighters and the bombers, turned inside one of the Germans, and let loose a long burst. My tracers ripped through his plane. He banked left, then suddenly dropped and smashed into the ground. When Charles Hall landed, the base erupted. Black ground crews, who had endured months of insults and dismissals from white personnel, finally had their answer. Hall's victory wasn't just a win in the sky. It was history. The first aerial kill by a black American pilot in U.S. military service. But the fight wasn't only in the air. By January 1944, after 7 months of combat, Colonel Maumier filed a scathing report. He claimed the 99th Fighter Squadron lacked aggressiveness and even recommended pulling them from combat. That report landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, who now weighed the possibility of shutting the entire experiment down. Then came Anzio. On January 27, 1944, the Luftwaffe unleashed massive raids on Allied forces holding the Anzio beachhead. 15 pilots of the 99th Squadron, flying outdated P-40s, suddenly found themselves facing the Luftwaffe's superior Focke-Wulf 190s. What happened next silenced the critics forever. The 99th tore into the enemy, shooting down multiple German planes. Reports differ. Some say 8 kills, others as many as 13 over just 2 days. Captain Charles Hall added 2 more victories, raising his total to 3. In 48 hours, flying inferior aircraft, they destroyed more enemy planes than they had in the previous 7 months of combat. The War Department ordered a study comparing the 99th with other P-40 squadrons. The result, they were performing just as well as their white counterparts. Anzio proved the truth. When given the chance, black pilots could fight, excel, and win. And in May 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group, made up of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadrons, received new orders that would transform them from outcasts into legends. The 332nd was sent to join the 15th Air Force as bomber escorts, flying long, dangerous missions deep into Nazi Germany. At Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, Colonel Benjamin Davis gathered his men. He was clear. We cannot afford to lose bombers. Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home. That simple directive became their creed. No matter what happened, stay with the bombers. In June 1944, General Nathan Twining ordered a new marking system so fighter groups could be identified instantly in the air. The 332nd was assigned red. Not just red stripes or red noses, but full crimson tails, red propeller spinners, and red bands. From that day forward, their P-51 Mustang stood out in the skies. The red tails had arrived, and everyone, friend and foe alike, would soon know their name. The first bomber crews escorted by the red tails didn't know their guardians were black. What they did know was that these fighters never left their side. They didn't chase personal glory. They stayed with the bombers. Word spread fast across the squadrons. If you can, ask for the red tails. On July 18, 1944, that trust faced its greatest test. Colonel Benjamin Davis led 66 Mustangs to meet up with bombers striking the Luftwaffe base at Memmingen, Germany. But the bombers were late. Davis made a fateful call: orbit in enemy territory rather than return to base. When the bombers finally arrived, so did the enemy, nearly 100 German fighters attacking from all sides. The Luftwaffe had figured out that sheer numbers might crack the Red Tail's shield. The sky erupted in chaos. The 382nd fought furiously, claiming 11 to 12 kills. But it came at a cost. In just 20 minutes of savage combat, 15 B-17s went down. 3 Tuskegee pilots were lost: Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving, and Alfred Brown. It was a brutal day, but the Red Tails had proven they would hold their ground, no matter the odds. Critics pointed to the heavy bomber losses at Memmingen as proof that black pilots couldn't handle major battles. But the operational reports told another story. The 332nd had flown into an impossible situation. German fighters were already swarming the bombers before the escorts arrived. Even so, they had prevented a total disaster. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe's regular fighters were no longer a real threat. Allied air power ruled the skies, but Germany still had one last weapon: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 miles per hour, it could outfly and outclimb anything with a propeller. On March 24, 1945, the 382nd Fighter Group received its toughest mission yet: escort bombers on a 1,600-mile round trip to Berlin to strike the Daimler-Benz tank factory. Intelligence warned that Me-262s from Jagdgeschwader 7 would be waiting. Leading 43 P-51 Mustangs straight into the heart of the Reich, Colonel Benjamin Davis prepared his men for the ultimate test. As they neared Berlin, the jets appeared on the horizon. Then the Me-262s appeared, the largest German jet force ever launched for a single interception. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown had studied their weaknesses. "We knew the German jets were faster than we were. Instead of chasing them head-on, we turned away and then cut back into their blind spots," he explained. Using that tactic, Brown climbed into position, fired 3 long bursts from 2,000 feet, and watched as his tracers ripped into the jet. The pilot bailed out at 2,500 feet. Brown had downed a Messerschmitt. Moments later, Lieutenant Earl Lane pulled off what many thought impossible: a 2,000-yard deflection shot with the new K-14 computing gun sight. His target, another Me-262, went down in flames. Lieutenant Charles Brantley claimed the 3rd jet kill of the day. In a single mission, the Red Tails had destroyed 3 Me-262s, more than most American fighter groups managed during the entire war. In one afternoon, they had surpassed the total number of German jets ever shot down by U.S. pilots up to that point. The message was clear. Even the most advanced weapon in Hitler's arsenal couldn't break the Red Tails. The 302nd Fighter Group earned a Distinguished Unit Citation for their jet fighter mission. But not every encounter with the Germans ended in triumph. 32 Tuskegee pilots were captured and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. Their stories revealed the strange clash between Nazi ideology and military reality. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was shot down on August 12, 1944, during his 19th mission. His P-51 took flak while strafing radar sites in southern France. Captured and interrogated, he was stunned by how much the Germans knew. The officer had information on Ramitelli Airfield, on our commanders, even on my parents' home in Detroit. He knew my father was a teacher and even my mother's maiden name. Their intelligence was frighteningly thorough. At Stalag Luft III, Jefferson was treated like any other American officer. White POWs from bomber crews often came to him with thanks for the protection of the Red Tails. In the prison camp, those conversations happened naturally. Conversations that segregation back home would have made impossible. Jefferson later reflected on the bitter irony. Here I was, in a Nazi prison camp, being treated more equally by white Americans than I would be in my own country. When the war ended and Alexander Jefferson returned home, reality hit hard. At the very dock where he disembarked, he was forced back into segregation. Ironically, it had been German pilots who had grudgingly acknowledged the Tuskegee Airmen's skill, calling them Schwarze Fliegermanton, the Black Birdmen. But it was American bomber crews who became their loudest champions. For the men who faced death on every mission, race meant nothing. Survival was everything. Stories spread through the bomber groups about the Red Tails, the way they flew tight formations, the way they dipped their wings in greeting, and their refusal to abandon crippled bombers. To the bomber crews, they weren't just escorts. They were Red Tail angels. The numbers backed up the legend. Air Force historian Dr. Daniel Hallman found that under Red Tail escort, bombers lost only 27 aircraft to enemy fighters. compared to an average of 46 with other P-51 groups in the 15th Air Force, and this was despite the 382nd flying some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the, where by the time the fighting ended, the Tuskegee Airmen had built a combat record that shattered every pre-war myth about black ability in the military. They had proven, beyond question, that skill, courage, and discipline had no color. The numbers told the story. 578 combat missions flown. Over 15,000 individual sorties completed. See now bomber escort missions, including 311 for the 15th Air Force. Enemy losses, 112 aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 more destroyed on the ground. On March 24, 1945, they even downed 3 of Germany's prized Me-262 jet fighters in a single day. Ground targets paid the price too. 950 rail cars, trucks, and vehicles destroyed. 254 locomotives taken out. On June 25, 1944, they crippled the former Italian destroyer, Giuseppe Missouri, leaving it beyond repair. Most impressive of all was their protection record. Just 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters under Red Tail escort, compared to an average of 46 with other groups. That superior record held across 179 escort missions. The names behind the numbers told their own stories. Lee Archer, 4 confirmed victories. Joseph Ellsbury, 4 kills, including 3 Focke-Wulf 190s in a single day, July 12, 1944. Edward Toppins, 4 victories. Clarence Lester, 3 kills in 1 mission, July 18, 1944. The honors matched the heroics. 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 744 Air Medals, 14 Bronze Stars, 8 Purple Hearts. The 99th Fighter Squadron earned 3 Distinguished Unit citations. The 332nd Fighter Group earned one of its own. By war's end, the Tuskegee Airmen's record was undeniable, etched in both statistics and sacrifice. The human cost was heavy. 66 pilots were killed in action. 32 were captured as prisoners of war. 84 more lost their lives in training and non-combat missions. Their transformation from being mocked to being respected wasn't just about courage. It was also about preparation. At Tuskegee, the training was tougher than anywhere else. Pilots logged 300 hours in the air compared to 200 for white cadets. Formation flying was drilled into them endlessly, because in combat, discipline would be their edge. The washout rate proved how demanding the program was. 60% failed at Tuskegee compared to 40% in white schools. Only the strongest survived, forming what Colonel Noel Parrish, the commander at Tuskegee, called a super-selected group. Their aircraft told another part of the story. The 99th started out flying second-hand P-40 Warhawks, planes already outdated when they arrived in North Africa. Against German Bf-109s and FW-190s, the P-40s were inferior in speed, climb, and firepower. But the Tuskegee pilots learned to exploit their advantages, better turning ability and rugged construction, to hold their own. Then came July 1944. With the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, everything changed. The sleek North American P-51D, with its Packard-built Merlin engine, could reach 437 miles per hour. The Red Tails finally had a machine worthy of their skill, and with it, they became equals to any fighter group in the world. The P-51 Mustang carried 6 50 caliber machine guns that could shred any enemy aircraft. But its greatest strength was range, over 600 miles with drop tanks, making it the only fighter able to escort bombers. Deep into the heart of Germany, behind every pilot who shot, down a German plane stood dozens of men who never took to the skies. Out of roughly 16,000 Tuskegee Airmen, fewer than 1,000 were pilots. The rest were mechanics, armorers, crew chiefs, the ground crews who kept the Red Tails flying. They were the unsung heroes of every mission. At Ramatelli Airfield in Italy, their conditions were far from ideal. The base was primitive compared to other American airfields, and the 332nd was often last in line for supplies. Spare parts were scarce, yet their aircraft readiness matched, or even beat, that of white units. These men weren't just fighting with wrenches and tools. They faced combat too. On March 24, 1944, a German air raid struck Ramatelli. Bombs fell, fuel dumps burned, and several ground crewmen were killed. Still, the surviving men worked through the chaos, dragging planes to safety and saving what they could. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Each B-17 Flying Fortress cost $238,000 and carried 10 highly trained crewmen. Losing even one bomber wasn't just a tragedy, it was a blow that rippled across the entire war effort. And thanks to the Tuskegee Airmen, both pilots and ground crews, many of those bombers made it home. This is why protecting the bombers mattered more than chasing aerial victories. Colonel Benjamin Davis knew it from the start. He reminded his men, "Anyone can shoot down a fighter if they leave their post. It takes real discipline to stay with the bombers when the enemy is running." The Red Tails built their tactics around that discipline. They created a three-layer defense, one group flying close, weaving right over the bombers, another set at medium range, ready to intercept enemy fighters, and a third flying high, watching for diving attacks. It demanded coordination, precision, and absolute focus. But the Tuskegee Airmen weren't just fighting the Luftwaffe. They were fighting two wars at once, against fascism abroad and racism at home. Every mission proved not just their skill, but their worth in a world that doubted them. Their combat record shattered both Nazi racial myths and America's own segregationist beliefs. Black newspapers celebrated their victories, making them symbols of pride and progress. Meanwhile, mainstream outlets often downplayed or ignored their achievements. That's why the Pittsburgh Courier's Double V campaign, Victory Over Fascism Abroad and Racism at Home, held up the Tuskegee Airmen as living proof of that fight. The difference between German and American awareness was striking. By 1945, the Luftwaffe knew exactly who flew the red-tailed Mustangs, calling them Schwarze Vogelmenschen. Yet back home, many white Americans didn't even know black pilots existed. That wasn't by accident. The War Department rarely shared the Tuskegee Airmen's successes. When victory came in Europe, white units prepared for parades. For the 302nd, the future was uncertain. The Army Air Forces planned to keep segregation in place, even after these men had proven how absurd it was. For decades after the war, their achievements were hidden from mainstream America. Many pilots carried that silence with them. Lee Archer, credited with 4 victories, built a successful career as an executive, but he rarely talked about the war. "Nobody believed me anyway," he admitted. "A black fighter pilot must be lying." Change came slowly. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially integrating the U.S. military, a decision shaped by the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record. Benjamin Davis, who once led the Red Tails over Berlin, went on to become the first black general in the U.S. Air Force in 1954. True recognition took even longer. In 2007, President George W. Bush finally awarded the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal, honoring them as the heroes they had always been. Only 300 of the original pilots lived long enough to attend their long-delayed recognition ceremony. Many had waited more than 60 years for America to finally acknowledge them. Their journey from mockery to respect wasn't legend, it was fact, backed by hard numbers. They scored 112 confirmed aerial victories against the Luftwaffe. On one mission, they brought down 3 Me-262 jet fighters. They destroyed 150 enemy aircraft on the ground. They lost only 27 bombers under their protection, compared to an average of 46 for other groups. Pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. The Germans knew them as the Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen, proof that prejudice collapses in the face of undeniable skill. Every German fighter destroyed, every bomber protected, every mission flown, built an irrefutable case. The color of a pilot's skin had nothing to do with his ability to fly and fight. Roscoe Brown, who once shot down a German jet over Berlin, put it best. "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and we won all 3 battles." The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just win battles, they changed the course of history. They fought 3 wars at once, and they triumphed in all of them, defeating the Luftwaffe in the skies, shattering Nazi beliefs about race with their performance, and helping tear down segregation in America through their undeniable excellence. When finally given the chance, the Tuskegee Airmen rose higher than anyone expected. They turned mockery into respect, prejudice into acceptance, and left even their enemies as witnesses to their extraordinary achievements.